For our next session, I'll be essentially sort of interviewing and discussing with someone most of you will be familiar with. She's a columnist at the Herald Sun. She has 2 shows on Sky News. She's also a regular on 2GB, 4BC, 3AW with Steve Price. She's a very powerful voice in the public chamber. And thankfully she has managed to make it just despite plane delays and the rest. So look, the topic, I guess it's a relatively loose topic, but it's essentially, our brief is to discuss tribalism, and that's certainly been a theme throughout the conference. And then I'll sort of interview Rita about some of her experiences, and possibly with a special focus on race, because it's something she's been writing about only in the past week as a way to sort of illuminate some of these types of issues. So now, okay, she'll be here in a second. So look, I'll do a bit of introduction. So look, some of you, who read Janet Albretson's piece today in the Oz? So look, fantastic piece, and obviously she spoke about similar themes yesterday morning. And I was very interested how she quoted this man, Robert Brooks, who was a relationship therapist. And this notion of what she calls the culture of contempt is very interesting. And when I was reading about this guy, Robert Brooks, talking about how you can almost tell when couples there's something in relationship therapy, when every couple that comes to you, they're either seeking to stay together or they're seeking permission to leave. But what she quotes about Robert Brooks is, when a relationship kind of dies when there's something about motive attribution. And this is an important term. So when there's a sense of contempt or disgust about how you attribute the motives of the other person. And that's a real sign of when a relationship is on its last legs and not easy to rehabilitate. Whereas when you still attribute a positive or a altruistic motive in your partner, in your ideological opponent, in wherever it may be, there's still a lot more scope there than for some sort of compromise, some sort of juxtaposition, some sort of overlap. And I think Janet's point was that we're reaching a point, are we reaching a point in the public discourse where often arguably on both sides there's an element of contempt. I suspect most of us would argue that on one particular side possibly has a stronger element of that. And Janet was certainly highlighting the most recent case with Rahim here, how there was an element of attributing certain motives to Rahim in terms of how he might have expressed his concern about issues that he cared about, and that it was certainly important to the community, but that how it was attributed to him held a degree of contempt. And I think that gives us a bit of insight when we talk about this issue of tribalism. Look, I think it's worth even thinking about the word, because you have various groups. So we exist in a whole range of groups, be it parties, be it unions, churches, whatever, sporting teams, whatever it is. But the very notion of a tribe, which is effectively how we evolved, we're hunter-gatherers, tribes. So there is something very primitive about us gathering in a tribe. But I guess what's dangerous about tribes in a democracy, that they're not really collections based on ideas necessarily. They're fundamentally based on identity. So then it's not necessarily about the ideas, it's really whether you belong. And where the signals you give are all about whether you belong, and you don't even ascribe, say, good or evil to that group. Your actions are about advancing the interests of that group at all costs. And that's when I think it can get particularly dangerous. And I think that's one of the risks that we have in some of our debates now. There have been lots of interesting studies in this arena. In fact, an Australian political scientist started a think tank called More in Common. and I urge you to look it up. And he looked at multiple categories of people, of groups. So it might be progressive activists, traditional conservative, the disengaged moderates, I think the exhausted majority. The other one was called the devoted conservative. There were various types. He had 7 different groups. And what he found was that particular values found through specific questions predicted the category most strongly. So I'll give you one example. If you believed it was more important for your child to be creative than be well-disciplined, that was a key predictor of you falling in the progressive activist category, for example. So it's just a good example that underneath, even though we have lots of debates around opinions, ideas, underneath it is a kind of value structure. And even it was very interesting just seeing, say, Jim Molan and Senator Roberts. So many of the debates I think we have, and a lot of the kind of rage and anger you see in public discourse is very often about groups. And the thing about groups, how do you set boundaries in a group? You hold something sacred, and likewise you have something taboo. So often what's happening is you have different groups with different ideas of what constitutes the sacred and what constitutes the taboo. So a good example here, I mean, many of you would fall into that category, the idea of sort of nation, military, certain traditions, patriotism, they would all be held sacred. And arguably in progressive arena, issues like, say, climate change, asylum seekers, etc., they would be held sacred. So you say something against that, even in the remotest way, you're suddenly seen as a heretic. And then it comes to those motive attributions. So suddenly the motives your opponents might attribute to you mean you just can't have a healthy, meaningful conversation. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to invite, actually, just a little bit more. So, look, in my work, look, there was a chance I was going to have to cover the whole session, so I did have to prepare a bit. Look, in my work, I guess one of the key things you notice that we're meaning-seeking creatures above all else. Above all else. So when you tear kind of the structures of traditional religion down, previously you could have sought meaning through religion, and then there was a political sphere. But increasingly now, people seek meaning through their ideological activity. And that's created a kind of a new level of heat in arguments, I think. So what are often matters of faith are then couched or packaged in terms of ideas or opinion or ideology or politics. And that also is, I think, a key danger. So, I've already introduced her, so please welcome and let her settle in a bit. She's literally landed about 20 minutes ago, halfway ago, and she's been rushed into the ballroom. So please put your hands together. Please welcome Rita Panahi.
Hello, folks. Oh, wow, there's more people there. This is a nice turnout. Thank you, Christina. This is wonderful. We had, on Tuesday night, Mark Latham thanked the advertising firm of Keneally Albanese for selling out CPAC. Before that, the public awareness was pretty low, but just like that, it was headlines around the country.
You're not the first to thank Christina at this conference, Rita. And in fact, there was a trophy presented to her by Craig Kelly in an earlier session.
We should actually, instead of an Oscar, have a Christina as the award and then give that to different people for... Is that what they've done? It's a... Oh, sorry, I thought it was a... Okay. Oh, that's fantastic. The Keneally Cup. Wonderful. So is that like a best on ground sort of a
MVP
prize?
Sort of thing, possibly?
Yeah, fantastic.
Now, look, let's, conscious that Rita's literally rushed in here, but now many of you will be familiar with Rita and her writings. Before we lead into that, I'm very interested in your history. You've built something of a media empire now, Sky, Herald Sun, 2GB, 3OW, 4BC, and elsewhere. But look, before we talk about matters like tribalism and race, just tell us a little bit about the relationship you have with your ancestry.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Look, I'm fascinated by my ancestry. The Persian history is a fascinating one, and I appreciate a lot of the elements of the culture, the food, the music. But I think my ancestry, like my eye colour or my height, are probably the least important things about me because I have no control over them. So as much as I'm interested in it, I don't look to it for affirmation or self-esteem or pity or pride. I find it fairly curious that people, we talk about cultural appropriation, but we've got victim appropriation where people sort of take on the victimisation their ancestors generations ago suffered and then live with it in their lives as if it has an impact, meaningful impact on them. I just find that to be so bizarre. Why would you want to afflict yourself with that?
Well, I think that's a very good way to introduce, say, what you wrote about most recently. And this overlap with sort of the Ben Simmons incident at the Crown Casino and what it tells us about some of the debates around race in Australia. Now, not everyone would have read that in the room, although I suspect many have. Well, tell us a little bit about that column and what you were trying to say there.
I tried to stay quiet about it because it was such a ridiculous thing, but at the end of the day, it had made not only national headlines but international headlines. It was this absolutely absurd allegation of racial profiling that is damaging Australia's reputation around the world because Ben Simmons is a big deal. He's an NBA star. He's on a $240 million contract. He is a big deal, and what happens to him gets reported. And any time an allegation of racism is made, the coverage becomes sort of a saturation thing. And him and his sister, his woke sister, were encouraging Australians to, check their privilege. And I pointed out there's nothing much more privileged than a bloke earning $240 million to play basketball, having his holiday to Australia subsidised by the taxpayer, and then still playing the victim because for a few minutes he was treated like everybody else. He didn't have the red carpet. He was asked for ID because he looks under 25, and that's the rule. He is under 25, by the way. So if you look under 25, they ask you for ID. If you don't, they let you in. And to accuse Crown, of all places, of racial profiling, anyone who's been there will know how absurd it is because it is the most ethnically diverse clientele and workforce imaginable. And as that story was making headlines around the world on Tuesday night, I was having dinner there. We have a family dinner there most weeks, paid for. It's not an advertisement. And I did something I never do, which is look around and racially profile all the other diners just to see what the mix was. And there was literally one table with Caucasian diners in the restaurant I was in. Everybody else was different ethnic backgrounds. And same with the staff. The majority of the staff were ethnically diverse. So to suggest somewhere like a casino is racially profiling people is just so absurd, but it gets accepted uncritically, gets reported around the world and just does more damage to our reputation. And, I think the issue with Ben Simmons is I don't think he cooked this up, and a lot of people think he did because he's a executive producer for the Adam Goodes doco, the second one, and they thought, this is a way to drum up business overseas. I don't think it was that calculated. I just think he's so preoccupied with race that anything that happens, he sees through a racial filter. So there can be no other reasonable explanation like, geez, I look under 25, I am under 25, maybe that's why I was asked for ID. It has to be racial, it has to be, that's the only explanation that they'll accept.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting comment. Like one of the aspects of my job is often assessing claims in the workplace. And it might be related to some sort of compensation claim around bullying, racism, sexism. And that is a very common thing you see, where so much of it is about perceptions and any single comment or any single event can have so many different perceptions. And so many of these claims are often coming through people who may have had some sort of mistreatment earlier in their life, or they've been in possibly a conflicted or violent relationship or something. And then suddenly everything is filtered through this lens of threat, through some sort of aspect.
Yeah, you become paranoid. In my column, I mentioned a Seinfeld scene, which I love. I don't know if you remember Uncle Leo. He was one of the underrated Seinfeld character. No, that's Elaine. But Uncle Leo and Jerry were at a diner and he gets this burger and it's overcooked. He'd ordered medium rare and they'd given him a medium burger and he just throws it down. He goes, "Oh, the cook's an anti-Semite." And Jerry's like, "He can't even see you. He's in the kitchen. He doesn't know what you are." And he's like, no, overcooked meat doesn't just happen. There's a reason. So, and, you know, that was a joke 20 years ago, but it's become reality now. Anything adverse or even mildly unpleasant that happens to you, it must be something.
Like the snooker balls or something like that. Yeah.
It must be something.
The one thing I observed, the reality is if you do go to the United States, there is a bigger charge around race, like especially if you go to the South, etc. So there's a lot more edge to the notion of race in debates.
It's been pandered to a lot more as well. So there's that's what I don't want us to happen here, because I think there's just so many dangers with it. And one of the dangers is this, Smollett hate crime hoax phenomenon. Here's the most famous example, but there's plenty of others, because that diminishes real incidents of racism. So when they do occur, it's like the boy who cried wolf. People doubt it, people question the veracity, and real victims then get mistreated.
Well, on that note, tell us some of your thoughts, and I know you've spoken and written about this, about the Adam Goodes saga, which has obviously been brought to prominence by a succession of films more recently.
Well, yeah, there was the doco which Channel 10 screened a couple of weeks ago, but the next doco is the one that they're planning to show internationally at cinemas. So that's the one that Ben Simmons is connected with. So to me, that's even worse, because I think most Australians who are aware of what happened with that and who are engaged in it, football fans, know precisely what happened. It was only 4 years ago. It's a bit too soon to be rewriting history. But an overseas audience who doesn't have that knowledge of the country and the issues behind it is just going to look at that and go, what sort of a horrible, xenophobic, racist backwater is this place? How could they carry on like this? That's the impression you're going to get. So I do worry about that a lot, because, I wrote about the Goodes saga as it was happening. There was a bunch of reasons why he was booed, none of them to do with his colour. I'm sure out of the thousands who booed him most weeks, there could have been a couple of racists. Statistically, there would be, but that's not why thousands were booing. They were booing because, one, he was playing politics, and it's so disingenuous to say, oh no, he was just standing up for Indigenous rights. Well, no, he was doing a lot more than that. He said something like, remember whose lands you're on. Now, that is highly divisive. As a migrant here, I see this country as much as mine as anybody's, whether they were born here or have Indigenous heritage. We're all equal, I would have thought. That would be a sort of a principle to uphold. And he was given the honour of being Australian of the Year, and to many, one, that wasn't earned, and two, he then went on to criticise the country for, use that platform not to be positive but to be divisive. And there's been plenty of other Indigenous players who have stood up for Indigenous rights. Michael Long would probably be the most prominent example, Nicky Winmar, there's been others, and they were never booed. In fact, their reputations were enhanced. What Adam was doing was something quite different. He was taking a very political stance, and that's why people booed, because people don't like politics intruding into sport. And I think another reason they booed was they were told not to. This booing was... well, the booing almost immediately, because you think the media's left-leaning. You have not seen the sports media. They're like the lunatic left fringe of the media. That's why, I think there should be some sort of a ban on sporting media giving any sort of political opinions. That's anti-free speech I can support. I'm kidding, of course, please. Don't put that in The Guardian, for God's sake. So the narrative around this almost uniformly from the media with a couple of exceptions, being me and Bolter and, I don't know, Neil Mitchell and a couple of others, almost uniformly was, this is horrible, sinister, racist, there's no other explanation. And the AFL took that on, the media took that on, and they lectured to the fans, do not boo. If you boo, you're racist. So what happened? The booing intensified because AFL fans don't like being told what to do, and they don't actually like being mischaracterised as racist either, which I would have thought was fair enough. So there's a number of other reasons, a number of things that happened that aggravated fans. So to just jump to this racism conclusion, and there was something happened earlier this year that didn't get much coverage, should have got more coverage, because it gives an insight into the sort of Australia these people want. Because after the docos came out, all I kept hearing from the earnest lefties was, let's just have think about the sort of Australia we want, and let's not allow this to happen again. Well, Kerry-Anne Kennelly, as you probably remember, got called racist on television because she dared question why anti-Australia Day protesters weren't as concerned about the rates of neglect and abuse in Indigenous communities. And for that, Yumi Steins called her racist on air. And Adam Goodes came out to enthusiastically applaud Yumi, said this is precisely what we want. She called it out on the spot. She didn't wait till afterwards. So this is the mindset that they want us all to adopt. When they talk about a better, kinder of Australia, to me, that's not better or kinder. That is silencing people and using slurs to make sure they don't step a foot out of line again. So I thought that was fairly illuminating in what sort of mindset these people have. I'm blabbering now. You go.
The writer Douglas Murray often talks about that the most heated discussions on race are happening in the least racist countries in the world. So be it Britain, North America, Australia, where we've integrated so many different migrants, there's extraordinary social mobility. But I'd argue it also says something about the Western world. There's a much greater capacity for self-criticism and self-analysis, which doesn't necessarily exist throughout other parts, most of the world. But tell us a bit about, in terms of discussions about race, what do you think it tells us about our tribes? And maybe even bring in the element of social media there, whether you think there's a factor there.
I'm not sure I accept that we obsess about race so much just because we're more enlightened than elsewhere in the world. I think there's a whole industry that wants us to have a race issue and keeps pushing the notion. The ACT Human Rights Commission or Tribunal, whatever they call themselves, they were recently fishing for business. They were, going out there saying, if you're a Muslim and you've been mistreated in some way, please make a report. It's easy and free, and just, follow these simple steps. Okay. Well, that's the state and territory-based one, not the Australian Human Rights Commission, which is again, why does that even exist? Why do we need that? What good does it serve as far as making us a better country? When it comes to social media, it's hugely important and not important at all at once. It's hugely important because it so often sets the public agenda because all of the media is on it. But it is so sadly out of touch with the mainstream. What matters on Twitter, what trends on Twitter, what people obsess about and talk about, most mainstream Australians couldn't give a stuff about, and that is a fairly common occurrence. But the problem is you've got all of the media commentators who have their own views reaffirmed by Twitter and go, well, everyone thinks like me, this has got to be the issue of the day. And then so you see that stuff end up in the mainstream media. So in that way, it is important, and that's why I think it's important for Conservatives to have a presence there, even though, you're more likely to be banned, you're more likely to be shadow banned, you're more likely to be abused. It's still, I think, important enough to have a presence there so there is some counter. But of course it adds to the polarisation. You've got the tribes there. But I think I'd like to see more boldness from Conservatives there. Obviously there's a line you don't cross over, but, don't let the left dictate how you carry yourself. If you want to make a joke, if you want to say something colourful, then do it. Don't play by their rules. So I would like to see, particularly for our politicians, a little bit more boldness on the platform.
I mean, one of my observations, and say take Raheem for example, it seems to be much easier for us. I was here. It seems to be much easier on our side of politics to overstep some sort of boundary that invites... Like, for example, if you're on the left, you can call anyone a racist or a sexist. And what exactly is the blowback?
Well, not just that, just what we saw out here today with those feral protesters throwing coffee at people, jostling, yelling just the most hideous abuse. Now, if they were right-wing or Conservatives carrying on like that, they would be doxxed, their workplaces would be contacted, they'd probably lose their job, they'd be publicly outed and shamed. But it just doesn't happen to that side. They don't have... Well, there's that. Well, or they work for the government, so it will be one or the other. They also have a job. So there is this great double standard, which is, I think, one of the things I like about Trump, because he often plays by the left's playbook. He says, I'm going to hold you to your own standards, or I'm going to play by your rules. And they can't stand it and they can't counter it. It drives them nuts. And I'm not advocating for that necessarily, but I think when they do, if they come after Raheem for rejecting Islam, then he's got every right to hold them to account by their own standards. And by their own standards, they're being absolutely racist, they're being bigoted, they're not respecting his lived experience. Can you imagine Christina Keneally having conniptions about a Christian who rejected the religion and was critical of the Bible? Can you imagine in a million years she saying they shouldn't be allowed into the country because... it just would not happen. So I think we do have to be better at holding them to account. I think too often we take the high road and it's like, oh, no, we're not going to lower ourselves to their standards. But no, hold them to their own standard. These are their rules. Hold them to those.
Now, thankfully, we have managed to have a wonderful discussion within this space, and Rita was able to arrive on time. But I think we have time for probably 2 questions, I think. So
do 3. Let's do 3.
Well, I might be able to... You're pushing it, Rita. Sir.
We've got 3 sections, so we should have...
Just a question, I'm curious. It's pretty obvious a lot of our journalists are left-leaning, but how is it that in the field of sport, journalists are left-leaning? I've never really realised that, but you say that's the case. Given that
this is one of the things I love about social media, particularly Twitter, is that it's completely exposed the media's biases. So if you want to see the political leanings of any journalist, whether they be a newsreader, news reporter, or a sports reporter, just log on to Twitter and you will see, and it's almost uniformly one way. I don't know, certain jobs attract certain types, and the media has long leaned left. I think now that's actually got worse and is worsening to the extent that there's a big divide between media opinion and popular or mainstream opinion, where they just don't understand. This is why they get so shocked by Trump or Brexit or the Morrison government winning the election, because they just, in their circles, it's bizarre. It's sinister.
So with the Eels scarf on.
I heard years ago about a particular chap called Billy Clinton who was called Teflon Bill. And I see this condition of Teflon coming up these days around Islam. talking about the way Islam is changing Europe, the UK, the US, and even here. Have you got any comments to that throwaway line?
Well, there is this bizarre alliance forming between Islamists and the regressive left, as I call it, where it really the only thing they share in common is a common enemy, being conservatives, but their personal beliefs and attitudes are completely at odds. You know, you only have to look at the treatment of minorities, the treatment of LGBT community, the treatment of women in Muslim majority countries to see that, you know, your so-called progressives should be pretty alarmed with that alliance. But for the moment, it seems to be serving both their purposes. Well, it is hard to criticise Islam. One, you know, you might get banned from the country, or they might try to ban you. And let's not forget, Christina.
Much worse than banning, Rita. You can get killed.
Yeah, you can have a fatwa against you. You can get really credible threats. We joke about it, but you know, we've had our journalists having to move houses, having to sell their properties because Bill Leak had to sell up, for example. I know Bolt has to move his family at certain times when the risk was elevated. I've had security at my place to make sure, you know, there's a plan if something happens. So, you know, you don't get that if you have a go at Christianity, typically. So there's that factor. And then there's, of course, you know, that racism slur, which again is so stupid to throw at someone who's critical of Islam. You know, Islam is not a race; it's a set of beliefs. You've got people who are Asian, African, white, all colours who are Muslims. You know, my family are Muslims. So I'm obviously interested in this, but I think it's just the usual tactics where they just slander you as a racist if you say anything, no matter how progressive you are in your values. So if you speak out against even FGM, they'll say, well, you're only doing that because you want to have a go at Islam, as if, you know, there's some ulterior motive in being against little girls being, cut up, yeah.
Thanks so much, Rita. I mean, on that point, I'd argue the left has constructed Muslims and Islam as a marginalised, secularised group almost. They haven't constructed them in terms of religion. And I think that tells us about something in tribes. As soon as the left as a type of identity, as soon as they see a certain group falling in the victim or marginalised group, then saying anything critical is against the worldview. But it
doesn't always hold, because you look at, say, Harvard University at the moment, where they're discriminating against Asian students. Now, you could argue Asians are minority. They fit a lot of the grievance points that you could assign to a minority group, but they work really hard. They get excellent grades, and they should be much more highly represented in the university like Harvard than they are. But they are judged more harshly because they try to have that diversity of having, you know, more Latino and black and all sorts of different students, and not just have the domination of Asian students. So the minorities only serve a purpose for the left as long as we are seen as downtrodden victims. As soon as you actually start succeeding, then they don't want to know you. Then you're no longer useful to
them. You don't fit that box anymore.
You no longer, if you don't identify as a victim, you are cancelled. And you know what? They will eventually turn on each other, and we're already seeing it in the UK, where, you know, they're trying to have these programs in primary schools about you have to accept everybody, whether you're gay, lesbian, or whatever, if you identify as a boy or a girl. And members of the Muslim community are going, no, thank you, not in our school. That's not happening, and they're having protests. Now, you're not seeing the left react to that as if they would if it was a Catholic parents saying that, but those clashes are already happening. And if you go to somewhere like Belgium, where is that god-awful place in Belgium? Where Molenbeek, yeah. Who were the first groups to move out of there? It was the gay and lesbian residents. They were the first to leave there. And if you see what's happened there, that is an extreme example. Hopefully we don't see that replicated here anyway.
It was fantastic that Rita was able to make it and for her fantastic insights today. So please thank Rita Panahi.
Oh, you're spoiling me.